Next, we're going to be talking about the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is fragile central nervous system tissue. It's enclosed within the protective vertebral column. It's also going to be surrounded by and have within it cerebrospinal fluid and is protected by the meningeal layers. Now, between the spinal cord and the vertebral column, there's an epidural space, so a space between the vertebrae and the dural sheath or dura mater of the meningeal layers, filled with fat and a network of veins. We're also going to look at where does the spinal cord begin, and it begins at the foramen magnum, which is the hole in the base of the skull, and actually continues down your vertebral column until about L1 or L2. That's the first and second lumbar vertebrae. And its functions is really just to be a two-way communication system between the brain and the rest of the body. But it does also contain spinal reflex centers. Now, when we're looking at the spinal cord kind of at its core, it has central gray matter. And that gray matter is going to be pointed in multiple locations. And towards the back are dorsal gray matter horns. And towards the front are ventral gray matter horns. The dorsal horns receive sensory input and then contain within them interneurons that process that somatic and visceral sensory input. Ventral horns are also going to have some interneurons, and they'll have some somatic motor neurons, but they're mainly going to function to communicate information to exit the spinal column via ventral roots and send information that is motor outward towards skeletal muscles. The lateral horns are not common. They're only present in thoracic and superior lumbar regions, and they consist of sympathetic neurons, which are a part of your fight or flight or autonomic nervous system. Then we have dorsal roots, which are where spinal nerves attach to the spinal cord in the back. And dorsal root ganglia, where cell bodies of sensory neurons attach. Now, dorsal roots actually are sensory in nature and would send that information into the spinal cord, and it would travel to dorsal horns eventually. And then ventral information would travel out the front, and that's always motor information. Alright, so let's look at the basic anatomy of the spinal cord. We have the central canal in the center, which would contain cerebrospinal fluid, internal gray matter, external white matter. In the back, where this spinal nerve attaches, is going to be a dorsal root. And in the front, where this spinal nerve attaches, is a ventral root. Where they combine, it's often considered a mixed nerve, where we have the cell bodies of the dorsal neurons. That is a dorsal root ganglion. If we look at the gray matter in the center, the points in the back of gray matter are dorsal horns. The points in the front that are gray matter are ventral horns, and occasionally you might see a side lateral horn. There's also the three dura mater, pia mater, arachnoid mater, meningeal coverings. And so you can see that it's very similar, at least in neuronal tissue terms, to the brain. We do have that different pattern of gray and white matter, but we still have the meningeal coverings, we still have blood vessels, we still have nerves. So when it comes to the spinal cord, and not just looking at that internal gray matter, if we look at the outer white matter columns, what we're seeing mainly is myelinated and some non-myelinated nerve fibers, but they're there to allow communication between parts of the spinal cord and the brain. Now, they run in three different directions. There's ascending pathways, so that's sensory inputs going to higher brain centers. There's descending pathways, where information from the brain is going lower, and it's usually headed out to motor output areas. And transverse. So that means information can travel from one side to the other of the spinal cord. So we can actually see the commissural area right here in the center. Both white matter and gray matter are connected, and that transverse movement is possible within these spaces. And in the gray matter, this area that goes across the central canal is called the gray commissure. Also keep in mind that the spinal cord has 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they're attached to the cord by paired roots. Down at the bottom of the spinal cord, you also have the cauda equina, which is a collection of nerve roots that are at the inferior end. And it's called the cauda equina because its structure looks kind of like a horse's tail. And then at the